we're going to begin. My intention with this is that we can have a dialogue, a discussion. By no means have I figured out what the best practices in psilocybin are. I have a bunch of questions based on kind of what I've seen and learned, and then a bit about kind of where I come from on this. So thank you all for being here. Acknowledge everybody's bringing their own experience, and the collective energy in this room is what's going to carry it. I'm just one part of this puzzle, so we can all participate together. And I want to acknowledge some very special people here who have helped me get to this point, particularly members of the ayahuasca community, and then a man who's very influential in my life, Don. Thank you for everything, and thank you for being here. So a theme I've come across recently that I really like and I think helps us understand the psychedelic journey, which is I think what we're talking about here. It's a journey, it's a quest for meaning, it's a quest for transcendence. I'm going to present a model of consciousness that I think helps us understand this. But I love this quote. Anyone listen to Kepacha? It's like an astrology report for the soul. Super cool. He talked about this last week, and he talked about expanding into the contraction, which I think is the essence of the psychedelic journey. I'm going to talk a little bit about why. So you notice it's both expansion and contraction. You got yin and yang, night and day, prakriti and purusha, creation and consciousness. It's always a dance. Spirit needs something to manifest through, and that is our techniques, our behaviors. And I think I'm interested in best practices largely because these are techniques and skills that have been refined for probably centuries. And we need to understand what some of these techniques are and how we can approach some of the spirit of the plant-based medicines. So that's a lot of information. Don't worry too much about this. That's just an outline of what we're going to talk about. And you can see I've structured it like the scientific journey. We have the welcoming, the ceremony begins, you have the onset, things are going to build, we're going to peak, then we're going to have the return, we're going to come home, we're going to do a little bit of integration, because it's always what you bring back from the journey that matters, right? Never forget that ceremonial space is one thing, but the point is ceremony without end. We're learning things in these journeys that are of benefit in the rest of your life, and that is the main beauty of them. We live in a society of quick fix. People want, particularly Michael Pollan's book, beautiful book. Everybody read it? Love it. It's called Changing Your Mind, How to Change Your Mind. So Michael Pollan's done a great job. He's done a great service. He's synthesized the history of psychedelic medicine beautifully. And he's a wonderful man. You can tell he's a gentle soul. The problem with the book, in my opinion, is it creates a view of the psilocybin experience and all psychedelic experiences almost universally positive, mystical. If you look at some of the outcomes that Mark was showing in these studies, and this is what I'm looking at, all these psilocybin studies, it's profound, the outcomes people are having. So what I want to know is, how is that happening? Because in my world, either in ceremony or working with psilocybin, not everyone has a mystical experience, and not everyone has a really positive experience, because these are heart medicines. This is healing. These are spiritual journeys. But we have a quick fix society. We want transcendence now, and I think we need to temper that with recognition this is a spiritual journey. Make sense so far? Okay, now apart from spiritual journey, this is the academic side. So my background is I was never historically an academic. I worked in the harm reduction sector for 23 years. I started needle exchanges, methadone clinics, did a lot of community health programming, worked in the early days around the AIDS movement, tried to prevent the overdoses that are consequential to the opioid epidemic with little avail, but I helped start some early overdose prevention programs. So my background is in harm reduction. So my motivation in this is to look at the psychedelic medicine and what the science is telling us to try to see if we can import that into better care and treatment for people who, in my opinion, get really poor, ineffectual treatment. There's a lot of kind of blaming of individuals for not overcoming depression, anxiety, PTSD, and substance use disorder. So my hope is driven for a desire for better care and treatment. I think it's been happening now for 40 years, but the outcomes we're seeing, which seem clinically validated, are quite astounding when it looks at our potential value of using particularly psilocybin in some of these contexts. But this is my main motivation, is to kind of work with people from a healing perspective. So just the boring stuff first. I got a librarian on my PhD committee who's wonderful. So we've done a bunch of literature reviews. We're in the process of reviewing all the literature on psilocybin that we can find, with a particular emphasis on psilocybin and anxiety, because the feeling is that anxiety is a condition that is both widespread and prevalent in our society, maybe the main disease of our zeitgeist right now, and I think it may be underlying a lot of the other manifestations, such as substance use disorder, and definitely is correlated with PTSD. So I'm particularly interested in anxiety and psilocybin, so that's part of the focus on the systematic review. Call for study participants. This time next year, I'm going to be wanting to talk to people about their use of psilocybin, and that is you. So part of the reason I'm here is to invite you and to let you know this study will be unfolding. I'm not at the point yet of taking human subjects, but I want to interview people on their use of psilocybin, how they use it, why they use it, and if there's any correlation with the management of mental health symptomology. So my hypothesis is that mushrooms are used for psychotherapeutic and spiritual benefit, and in the self-management of mental health symptomology. And when it comes to that, self-efficacy is what's really important. The ability you can kind of take action, have outcomes, and feel like you're kind of a co-creator in your own existence. So these are my emails if you want to stay in touch. And I can kind of get you in touch with you in other ways. So Mark Hayden did a really, really good job on looking at the history of psychedelic medicine. So this is something that's been going on for more than, well, really 50 years. These are the great names. We need to recognize we're standing on the shoulders of giants. And so I think a lot of you know these people. This is the more interesting stuff now. The work of David Nutt, Robin Carhart Harris, Mendel Kaelin, music as a hidden therapist coming out of the Imperial College in London is super interesting. All the fMRI studies and what it's telling us about the brain, about the seat of ego, and how we can achieve transcendent, trance, or meditative states using psychedelics. Sorry, this thing keeps popping up on the screen. You can't see, but I have to move. So observation about this, where are the women and people of color in terms of psychedelic communities? Our history is very male-dominated, very white, so I'm just naming that as a white male here. What is the role of indigeneity, and is there any cultural appropriation? I think we need to understand the lineage of these medicines. What are the correlates? This is the really interesting stuff to me. If we know that in psilocybin, sound is very important. In ayahuasca ceremonies, sound is very important. In any psychedelic journey, we have inner visuals. So the whole issue on sound therapy, the role of song, the role of chanting, all these things are super interesting. What are our communities of practice? A lot of this gets framed as individual therapy, but I think we all know that healing is a collective journey. That's the role of ceremony. So we can't just make this a new doctor-patient relationship. And I came from that world. I spent 23 years trying to change the medical-pharmaceutical establishment, and it's not going to change. Science drives clinical practice, and there's so much science happening right now in psychedelics, it's inevitable. It's going to enter the world of medical practice, and we're already seeing that with ketamine and with MDMA. Not a problem, but we need to understand we can't talk about mushrooms without recognizing Maria Sabina. Where did this come from? How did Westerners get exposed to this? And it comes down to Maria Sabina. So we ask for her blessing in the work we're doing. And again, if you haven't read the Michael Pollan book, it's a good one to read. So the current state of psychedelic research, or psilocybin research, there's 4 main engines. My favorite is the folks in Imperial College in London. But you have the Johns Hopkins people. Has anyone ever met Bill Richards? He was in Toronto. Such a beautiful man. So you look at some of the outcomes that they're getting in the Johns Hopkins studies, and you have to assume part of it is because their psychotherapist was Bill Richards. The man is a beautiful man, and he's got deep spiritual knowledge. So if you haven't read his book, Sacred Knowledge, you need to read it, because these aren't just molecules that have their effects scientifically. They have a spirit, and they require kind of practices and techniques to help shape, contain, midwife that spirit, for lack of better words. You got the stuff coming out of New York. So you see this is mostly scientific clinical stuff looking at end-of-life anxiety, and a lot of neuroimaging correlates are underneath it. So it's mostly clinical and it's mostly scientific, which is a little different than harkening back to Maria Sabina. Maria Sabina was a Mexican curandero who first brought magic mushrooms, I guess, to the Western consciousness. There was Gordon Wasson was an amateur mycologist and investment banker. He had a Russian wife named Valentina, and they were super interested in mycology and mushrooms. So they had heard about these cults of the wondrous mushroom that use mushrooms for healing, for visionary purposes. So they went into Mexico and eventually found in a small village a woman named Maria Sabina. They then wrote a Time magazine article, 1953, that hit the mainstream. That's how Timothy Leary heard about this. A lot of the early psychedelic researchers were exposed and got their traction in psychedelic interest through a mushroom experience, largely because the Time magazine article talked about this, had pictures of Maria Sabina during all-night Veleda, where she'd sing and chant all night in the darkness under mushrooms. So that's when the West heard about it. A bunch of hippies came down in the village, destroyed the village. She had her house burned down. Right? So we got to acknowledge the gifts. Okay, so sorry. The research is mostly scientific, mostly clinical. It's often end of life. Their sub-themes are on spirituality, mysticism, and meaning making. Academics get really uncomfortable on this stuff. So I'm always told, don't get into the mysticism side. Don't talk about it. But I'm like, that's what changes people. So I've been taught to talk about meaning making instead. So that's the role of archetype, myth, all that kind of stuff, right? So I think I can get away with it. But the current research is not so much community-based, it's very scientific, it's very expert-based. It's not participative. I don't think the people involved in the studies are helping to shape the themes that are identified after. I come from a community-based research perspective in harm reduction. We did research around HIV and hepatitis C and injection drug use for 20 years, and this is still not to the point we need to get it, which is involve more people who use it in the decision-making. And it's not really very inclusive of microdosing. There's not a lot of literature on microdosing yet. I know there's some people here who are experts in that. That's not my area of expertise. But I think that this literature we need to remember when you talk about microdosing. And that in itself, I work with a lot of veterans in the Kingston area who have PTSD, who, by the way, are really the ones who drove medical cannabis movement and the decriminalization of cannabis. We are veterans that. And the activists who did this for 30 years and spent time in prison. That's why cannabis is being decriminalized. So we need to better understand microdosing. The veterans I work with, when they talk about microdosing, they're taking 1 gram to 1.5 grams of magic mushrooms, calling it microdosing. It works for them. It silences everything, so they can focus. So I think it's a beautiful medicine for that. A little explanation of shamanism and the magico-religious phenomena. There should be magico. The role of myth, cosmology, and animism. So if you take even the ayahuasca experience, indigenous peoples or the Mestizo communities, when they'd have ceremonies, they would have a cultural worldview that was animated. There were spirits in the woods, there were spirits in the animals. So then under an ayahuasca ceremony, you have all that kind of potentiated a little more. In our world, we flatten the magic out. We have a disenchanted world. We have a massive chasm with our natural environment. We consider ourselves separate from the ecosystems that are part of it, which is part of the beauty of mycelia and mushrooms, underground networks, rhizomal networks of trees, underground communication. We're all interconnected. This is the deep interrelatedness you find in the egoless state of a psychedelic journey or in Buddhism. So we need to understand the role of mythology and the phenomenology of the experience. What's actually happening? Because other than Benny Shannon's work on ayahuasca, there's not a lot on the phenomenology of these visionary experiences. What's actually happening? What are people seeing? How are they processing it? And what meaning are they making? So that's where I think the real fun is. So far, when we do our systematic reviews, psilocybin has been proven to have positive clinical outcomes on 22 separate disorders, and I've listed them here. You can see everything from substance use disorder, depression, anxiety, often the existential fear related to terminal diagnosis and end of life, but has been shown to treat cluster headaches. The newest development, which is uber interesting, is the role psilocybin has in reducing inflammation. And if you know much about the endocrine system and the systems of your central nervous system and how everything works in terms of your sense of fear, your emotions, a lot of it is inflammation-based. We know inflammation causes a lot of both joint and self-immune disorders. So if we can use psilocybin to reduce inflammation systematically in the body, that's a terrific benefit. And you can see what we have is a molecule or a spirit or a plant that can be used to treat a variety of, and this is really counterintuitive in the scientific world. The medical pharmaceutical establishment is, you have a disorder, you have a particular treatment for that disorder, everything else is off-label. What we're finding here is a medicine that has a generalized benefit and can be used to treat multiple disorders. So part of what the folks in Imperial College are advocating, they're doing the neuroscience, the fMRI, under psilocybin, is that it's a new concept called the unified theory of mental health. Are people familiar with this? That all the different disorders, and you have to remember, when we use terms like anxiety and depression, PTSD, those are disempowering terms invented by the medical, scientific, pharmaceutical establishment to disorder you and how you manifest your experience of life. But we're realizing that all of these different disorders, which are thought to be things intact, they blend together, first of all, and they're largely written so people can get insurance, health insurance coverage. So they're boxes people get put into that simplify you. And then the treatments are very specific, and we know that pharmaceutical treatments for anxiety and depression are woefully inadequate. Our success rates in treating addiction are probably between 4 and 12% at best. So we know that this is all counterintuitive to the scientific medical landscape as it stands right now. So the question is, where is this all going to go? So when you read the literature, these are other things that come up that are interesting to me. Dosage and dose-related effects. We're going to talk about this. Mark talked about that earlier. The protocols, how are these? So if you're reading a study on the therapeutic benefits of psilocybin, what pre-session counseling were people given? What were they told are the expectations of the treatment? What was the setup of the clinical room? What else was done other than giving them usually synthetic psilocybin? And what's the difference between the psilocybin in a synthetic form as a molecule and magic mushroom in its whole context, surrounded by other molecules? So that's an interesting thing for me. What does this mean for new treatments in psychiatry? Psychiatry does not have the best history in sensitively treating the human spirit. So are we going to empower psychiatrists now to use these mind-altering medications? Not sure. What are the assessment tools and outcomes studied? What are the treatment goals? Effect on empathy and moral decision-making. It seems that psilocybin makes you a better person. You're less likely to be authoritarian in your views. What are the predictors of success? So if we're going to bring people into psilocybin therapy, how do we know for whom it works? Are there people it's contraindicated for? And are we going to select just for those who we know do well, which I think usually happens in scientific studies? One of the most interesting things I read is there is one study that says the way you speak, in terms of your natural language patterns, will predict your success in psilocybin therapy. So they can they use software to look at pre-interview kind of conversations, and they can predict, based on the structure of your grammar, who's going to have a positive experience and who isn't. Interesting. And we know mystical experiences predict success as well. So do you combine meditation and spiritual practices? And if so, when, how, what form, who's doing them? And are those the real benefit? And then I'm interested in time for a lot of different reasons, largely because I think it's one of the major reasons we struggle in our world right now is we don't understand time. Obviously, these visionary plants help us have a deeper understanding of time. And then this notion of time control and temporal control is interesting. So we'll leave that aside. That's a whole other workshop. But the psychedelic journey, which is what we're talking about, is a quest. Robin Carhart-Harris out of London talks a lot about entropy and the entropic brain. Are people familiar with this notion of entropy? This is uncertainty. And I'm going to revisit this later when I present a model of human consciousness. But one of the most important things to realize is whenever we enter these psychedelic states, what's happening is your brain is entering into entropy. So, and without getting too much in the neurobiology, there's about 7 brain hubs or systems of neurological ordering in your brain. So we're getting away from just talking about molecules and synapses and receptor sites and agonists, although that's important. We're looking now at the molecules in their overall environment. What's the ecology of the brain? And what we're learning is that psilocybin, under fMRI studies, is suppressing that part of your brain, which is the hierarchy, it's the captain, and it's called the default mode network. And that's the seat of your ego. Your brain is a reduction machine. It is the reduction machine, filters everything out, habitual thinking, and it's very much synaptic pruning, which is narrowing of thought. What psychedelics do, expand into the contraction in a psychedelic state where you're usually minimizing sensory input. And a lot of these studies involve putting an eye mask on and really good headphones with a good playlist, although that's the whole playlist issue is a whole other thing to talk about. So you're contracting your sensory input, no vision, just sound, under the influence of psilocybin, and you're having internal vision. So you're expanding into that contraction. You meet it at its limits, and that's where you learn to expand. So that we need to understand a little bit better. But this notion of entropy is that uncertainty, because you don't know anymore how you're supposed to see the world or how to behave. Your normal images of yourself dissolve. This is ego dissolution. It can be terrifying for a lot of people, there's some anxiety, but if you surrender into it, you realize a deeper sense of identity, right? Which is pure consciousness. So you decrease external inputs, decrease sensory input. This is more the yoga. You know, yogis are like all about reducing unnecessary mental chatter, reducing sensory input, going into the woods, reclusive. And so within psychedelics, is this a trance state? And is it the same state as yoga samadhi? Is it the same state as nirvana? Is mystical ecstasy and rapture the same as samadhi, these deep states of consciousness? We're trying to figure out their relationship. So if we're going to do this with people, we need to get our cosmology figured out and a sense of what's happening in consciousness, which I don't think we have right now the cultural tools. And that's my one worry. I think cannabis decriminalization is obviously a good thing. I don't think for the most part people know how to use cannabis. I don't think they're taught to respect the spirit of the plant. So I think we have a long way to go to develop literacy around cannabis, but still a big believer in decriminalizing. So that's all the kind of review of the scientific stuff. Now we're looking at clinical versus recreational use, because we know that magic mushrooms have been used in naturalistic sense by all of us, by you most likely. So what is the relationship between the clinical paradigm that's unfolding, which is a therapist in a clinical room with synthetic pharmaceutical-grade psilocybin at high doses, and you're laying on a couch with eye mask on and earphones? What is the relationship of that to the traditional healing paradigm that would be found, say, for example, within indigenous cultures, whether it's in ayahuasca ceremonies or within the curandero ceremonies in Mexico, or within, as Mark mentioned, the Huichol use of peyote? So what is the relationship of the plant to this? Because we're now into synthetics, so what happens to the plant? I think the experience of magic mushrooms compared to psilocybin is different, although there's a famous story Marie Sabina was given by Hoffman, synthesized psilocybin, said it is the same thing, so you have to respect that. But what I find is synthetic psilocybin is more predictable. Magic mushrooms, in my experience, have a certain wondrous magic, a certain pan energy, a certain trickster side. They can be playful, and that's why they're relatively difficult to work with. from a shamanistic perspective. Right? Does that make sense to people? Okay. Yes?
So are you saying that in your clinical trials that you're only using chemical psilocybin?
All the clinical trials that I'm citing here use synthetic psilocybin.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. High doses. Dose we're going to talk about, because in terms of best practice, dose is the number one thing we need to talk about. And then instead of this deficit-oriented clinical practice we're all evolving to, which is to use psilocybin to treat trauma, to treat addiction, how about a healing-centered engagement without defining people by their disorder or by their pathology or by their deficit? So we're trying to build actually how people build spirit and how people build power, and power in a positive sense, not power as power over. So I think that's getting a little bit lost, which is, so the recreational reports, when we take magic mushrooms, people report deeper connectivity to nature in particular, to trees, to the earth, a sense of heart opening, right? It's heart medicine, and that's why it can be difficult for people sometimes. Connection with nature, connection with others, some difficult experiences, but definitely the psilocybin journey reflects the hero's journey. If you look at Joseph Campbell, the whole idea you need to separate, you go off somewhere and you return. So we've understood the stages of the psychedelic journey, and it matches that. Joseph Campbell, yeah. Joseph Campbell is a religious historian, Hero of the Thousand Faces. Yeah, the hero's journey. So yeah, the hero's journey I'm riffing on. So what of shamanism? Not a lot of mention in this so far in the conference, but this is what brought us here. This is what Maria Sabina does. This is the practice. This is the lineage it comes from. So our doctors or psychotherapists are new shamans. If you've read Michael Pollan's book, that's the note he concludes on. He says basically if we're going to do this, we need a cultural container for these strong plant spirits. And it seems to be the psychotherapists in the clinics are using shamanic type techniques to get positive outcomes. So shamanism is a fabric of techniques to help channel, direct, contain, and otherwise act to assist in the manifestation of a plant spirit. And it comes down to fine-tuning techniques. Shamanism is a craft, and these are techniques that people learn through experience and through a lot of dedication. If you've read Mircea Eliade's book on shamanism, he refers to shamanism as archaic techniques of ecstasy, of mystical rapture, of connection. The role of shaman is serving the plant medicine, establishing the ceremonial space, pacing the ceremony, singing. In ayahuasca, be acaros. In peyote, you have a lot of drumming, a little faster sonic percussion, and many play a variety of instruments, whether they're rattles, chiapas, or fairy bow, different harmonics, shanty bells. So music is very important within shamanism, and I would say sound is very important to the psychedelic journey, and that's part of what we need to extract from this. Within ayahuasca, sound is generally gentle, lilting, lyrical. There's not a lot of fast-paced drumming. There's not a lot of loud singing. How we present ourselves and our voice is very important. I've noticed this conference is a lot of loud projection, a lot of fast talking, which I know I'm guilty of, but sound is really important. Sound is vibration. It's textural, and I'm synesthetic, so you kind of know this, but I find sound very affronting if it's either out of sync or very aggressive. But sound is a fabric. This is the matrix, and that's why sound is important. We're going to talk about that. So you have this notion of the music or the sound that matches the medicine, and that it's a channel for the medicine to come through. The sacred always needs something to manifest through. So what is the role of the guide within psychedelic psychotherapy? Are they the new shamans? I've seen some of the training guides or training manuals for the guides, some good stuff in there. What is the role of dosing? How much are we going to dose people? The clinical bias, which I come from in setting up methadone clinics, was always start low and go slow because you didn't want to overdose people. You cannot overdose someone on psychedelics. And I think we need to get over this bias we have on lower dosing and going slow. And I'm going to talk about this in a minute, but within serotonergic agonists such as this, if you underdose, you may actually have an inhibitory effect. And people actually don't have anything or have a negative effect. So we need to get the dose right. Threshold is important, no real risk of overdose. It's really just painful or negative experiences, which is the role of guide to help them through that. Guide is intended to hold space and help navigate difficulties arising. Otherwise, I would say the person should probably just stay out of the way. Let the medicine have its manifestation. So what are the best practices as far as I can figure out so far? They're dose dependent, the importance of threshold. If you looked at even Mark's slide, those are high doses of psilocybin. I think they equate between 4 and 6 grams of magic mushrooms. Yep.
So around the dose, psychedelics have, this thing where, you do it the next day and, they start low and go slow. Even, you double it the next day, and then if you double it and double it and double it, you're never getting, and then we're through a week and, then go, take 5 grams for something 2 weeks later, right? You're going to go from doubling it up to to 5 grams and having very little effect by the time you get to it, because the efficacy each day is less.
Absolutely.
So how
Yeah.
do you kind of balance that without like breaking people's brains?
That's a really good question. Yeah. I'm not sure I have an answer, but let's go through the rest and see if we touch on it a bit, and maybe you can bring it up again if we feel we don't. Does it make sense? I'm not quite sure how to answer it right now. Yeah. Yes.
The music, do you use, or do people use music all the time with this?
Yeah, so I've got, I think, 5 different playlists so far from different clinics. So my interest is in breaking down what I call the black box, or the opaque box, of these programs and of these studies. And what I mean by what an opaque box is, you have a bunch of inputs coming in you can see. There's a box you can't see into, then you have outputs. So we know the outputs are everything Mark talked about, all the positive clinical outcomes of psilocybin, and we know the inputs are psilocybin in the clinical setting. But the black box is how it's actually being done, which we can't see. So part of what I want to do in my review is break open that opaque box and figure out what are the practices, what are the sound frequencies, what are the playlists they're using. So if you look at the Johns Hopkins playlist, which is on Spotify, people probably listen to it, it's very classical based, very dramatic. My experience is that doesn't resonate for a lot of people. I'd encourage you to look at the work of Mendel Kaelin, which is online. You can find him on SoundCloud. He's a PhD researcher from Imperial College. It's very much source resonance. It's a lot of reverb, very low end, and kind of static sound. Mendel Kaelin, Kaelen. Yeah, a lot of people believe more in naturalistic sounds. I have a friend who's helping me with some sound, and we're looking at the role of just storms, thunder and lightning, using waves, natural sounds like that. I got an acoustic musical prof who's looking at natural sounds to see if that works well under psilocybin. And some people would argue just based on one's favorite music. I'm not totally sold on that, but yes.
Have you looked into binaural beats?
Yeah, I don't not know a ton about it. I know it's about the theta waves, and I think it's definitely onto something, and part of what I'm trying to do is build an immersive sound therapy system, which you really need 8 different speakers for true surround, and you need to record in 8 different tracks and layers as well, and that's when you get true immersion, and that's when you can get true sound healing. So I think binaural beats play with that same idea, and I think really help in terms of meditative focus. So remember, sound is vibrational, it's time-based, so again, back to time. This is part of the mystery we're trying to unpack, and it's emotive, it's expressive. The importance of inner vision, people use eye masks in darkness. So these are the best practices as far as we can figure out if you want to get good outcomes. Give them a good sized dose. So Terence McKenna, the heroic dose, he might have been onto something after all. The one thing I will say is you cannot heroic dose without the proper preparation set and setting. If you go into it with any degree of anger, with any degree of ill feeling, you will have a difficult experience, and many of us have been lost in that before. So if you're going to do high doses, you really need to take it seriously, and that's where the sacredness of it comes out. Coaching, preparation, and integration. So I call this a Bill Richards effect. So Johns Hopkins is getting these great outcomes, and I want to know, was it because Bill Richards is such a great guy? And he's like counseling all these people, and he's helping, right? He's giving a lot of technique. There's a lot of skill in there, but we don't talk about that. So let's want to break open. What's this black box look like? What's he saying to people? What has he figured out? And what is he teaching people? So he's kind of shamanistic in that way. And then the importance of setting, obviously. We're almost through the slides, so there's going to be lots of time for questions. So my concerns in all this is science becomes clinical practice. The science is booming. This is not just here. I'm one of a cohort of a bunch of people across Canada doing psychedelic medicine research right now globally. It's expanding. The people I talk to who are academics love this stuff. They're all over it. They want to redo their labs to start studying it. So we're going to lose control. We're going to lose power over it pretty quickly, and it's going to get translated into who can make a profit, what regulatory body can license it. And that's why I'm not totally sold on the public health model Mark presented on how we want to go forward with this. Because I worked within that for 20 years, and there's a lot of limits to working within a bureaucratic regulatory system, but we need to figure that because bureaucracy downgrades everything, and it flattens the spirit of this. So we need to figure out how we're doing it, and how do we evoke the plant spirit? Because none of these articles, the 250 we've reviewed so far, really, they don't talk about the spirit of the mushroom as a spirit that you're coming into contact with, just like ayahuasca is a spirit. So we need to figure out where's the plant spirit fit in all this. And I had a woman a little while ago who has full right to say this because she's deeply practiced, but she warned me about blending these two worlds. She said, keep them separate. Don't bring the medicine into the academic world. It will fail. Your project is a failure. Like, ah! But she made a really good point, which is that we're going to do this. We're trying to bring something that is sacred into something that is non-sacred, and so how do we translate it? I'm convinced it can be done, though. Is the future an ex machina kind of future? So a friend of mine and I were talking, like if we could get really good psilocybin, and we could work out the stages of the journey, the time-based, what people go through, and we can pay attention to their breathing and the sounds they're making, and perhaps put sensors on them to detect heartbeat, blood pressure, we can figure out where in the psychedelic journey they are, and we can hit it with music to accentuate or potentiate that stage of the journey. But then think about that. That's a lot of power. We're kind of, this is people's unconscious. So we need to do this with a great degree of preparation. So I'm not sure the X machine is like this robot, like where people can be on mind control and we can use these drugs to do this. So I'm not saying that's the future, but we need to guard against these. Essentially, the medicine has its own intelligence. And that's what we need to return to listen to. As humans, we think we're the smart ones. But look around the world, right? So let's start listening to the plants. What are they saying and all this? Okay, so this is where I'm going to get super trippy. I don't know what happened to my slide there. That's weird. Okay, so just pay attention to this picture. I've just got 2 more slides, and then we're done, and we can have lots of questions. Anyone seen this before? It's a 1971 article by Roland Fisher. It's called A Cartography of Meditative and Trance States. You can't read the bottom. But essentially what he tried to do is figure out trance states and map the mind, which is the name of this conference, which is why I thought this was super relevant. Plus, if we're going to understand the psychedelic journey and understand psilocybin, we need to understand what's happening in consciousness. We don't have an effective model of consciousness. If I asked you right now how to explain consciousness, where it's different layers, how many levels of consciousness are there? Where do you go in these journeys? Most of us would have a hard time answering that, other than we know there's the unconscious, there's connectivity, but we don't have a deep connectivity or a deep lineage in our world to help us understand our inner world, the cosmology, the spirit world, that's kind of been killed in Western society, other than indigenous traditions maintaining it, and us rediscovering pagan and Celtic rituals and bringing the plant-based medicines from the Amazon. I think the medicines are spreading by their own, but we're learning from them. But he's trying to figure out what's happening. And so on this side over here is what he calls, this is the inner journey of silencing. This is yoga samadhi. This is when you're taking the perception, that's your normal eye state there. And if you're going to quiet all your associations and mental imagery, you're going to come down to a state of that deep interrelatedness, the emptiness of Buddhism. And that's that yoga samadhi. So it's like hypoarousal. You're kind of coming, as you enter meditative, you get more tranquil and you come down into a point of stillness. The other side is mystical rapture, which is more naturalistic, more shamanistic. This is ecstasy, this is dance, this is expression, this is music, and you build and build and build until the point you hit mystical rapture, and that's a state of ecstasy. So on one side, that's ecstasy, which is outward facing. On the other side is ecstasy, which is inward facing. Now the neat thing is he put this little loop down here to show you can go from one to the other, because they're really the same. So you give a Tibetan Lama psilocybin or LSD, what's going to happen? Generally, they report nothing, because they're in that state already, right? But anyway, so we'll go back to that. So here's, and I'm going to leave it here, this is the model I'm proposing. It's going to take a minute, but I think we need to understand what's happening in the psychedelic journey if we're going to make any sense of it, because largely our guides need to give people the symbolism, the interpretation. We need to map the meaning of this, and we need to make sense of what's happening. And I think we have a poor idea of how consciousness works or who we are in this world. So the way that I've basically done it is if you look at Roland Fisher's diagram, the one before, which I'll flip back to quickly. See, he's got a left side and a right side, and the middle side is normal. So with mine is I've taken normal and I flipped it into the bottom. So your eye consciousness normal reality is under here. That's ordinary reality. Top is non-ordinary reality. Who am I referencing here? Who's read there? Carlos Castaneda. Ordinary and non-ordinary. Your eye is down here. So what's in the middle between ecstasy, which is meditative tranquility, and ecstasy, which is visionary, mystical rapture, is what I'm calling entropy, which is the Robin Carhart-Harris term for what's happening in your brain when you have experiences of uncertainty. And that can be the psychedelic journey, but it can also be anything in your life that throws you for a curve. It can be traumatic loss. It can be nature's wonder. It can be coming across something where we have children, and we had a friend bring us a caterpillar, a monarch caterpillar, so we've watched this caterpillar grow from a little speck into this big caterpillar, and it's now hanging from the top of its little thing and turning into a butterfly. So we're watching metamorphosis in action. Transformation is always the secret. It's all about alchemy. So the transformation that can happen here is in entropic state is because of uncertainty, you can move into a state of connective consciousness. This is the world of meaning making. And if the bottom part is ordinary reality, which is ordinary perception, and if you go towards the doing side, which is mystical rapture, daily routines are important. How do we spend our time? How do you shape your life? What do you do with it? Rituals, uber important. We've lost track of this, right? So as you move this way, you get more and more into that, and you can move into this. If you go the other way and you're into yoga in terms of meditation, you can go relaxation. Tranquility can bring about epiphanies, insights, right? And you can move into this meditative ecstasy. My argument is you can go from here, which is your normal I state, straight up to there. People have heard of the diamond vehicle, thunderbolt vehicle, Tibetan Buddhism, sudden enlightenment. This is the psychedelic journey offers. You can go straight from here into there, into entropy. 20 minutes in, peak state, an hour to 2 hours, you're in entropy, which can be a mystical experience. It can be. It isn't for everybody, but how do you get it to be a mystical experience? So this is the other side. This is ordinary reality. This is the other side. This is the world of spirit and archetype. This is what we need to start unpacking. How do we make sense of these things? The visuals we have under psilocybin, under mushrooms, how do we make sense of that? What is that? They're beautiful. They're also teachers. These are teachers. They're not just there to change us or fix us. We got to get over this notion there's something wrong with us, or we need to change something, and maybe start to learn a little something from the plant. So we need to remember the visionary side is connection, and you can move from this ordinary eye awareness into connective consciousness. So if you look on this axis over here, this is all motivational, affective stuff. This is doing, this is music, this is moving, affects emotion, it rouses. This is inward. This is psychological, and it's inhibitory. This is when we're quieting. So you can either quiet or you can arouse, and either way it can take you into entropy. And entropy, as you've noticed, bridges both the ecstasy and meditative. It's got elements of both. So I've just built on the model to create what I call a wheel of consciousness, a continuum of ecstatic on the left and ecstatic on the right, with a psychedelic journey with the entropic state up the center. Again, entropy is a term I'm totally lifting from the Imperial College people in London. So thank you. So along the vertical axis, you have motivational affective activities. They're outward-oriented behaviors. And over here, you have inhibitory and psychological reduction, right? Yoga is about reduction, calming the fluctuations of the mind. That's the Yoga Sutras. So this is about reduction. That's about kind of arousal. And then I'm building that. I've just got two hemispheres, and I have ordinary reality and non-ordinary reality, or what I call the other side. But notice it's a wheel. What is it about a circle? There's no beginning, there's no end. These borders are imaginary. They blend into each other. We need to get over this notion that things are in blocks. Things are in movement. They're in pattern, right? That's what you see under mushrooms. You see the expression of spirit through pattern. So I'm going to leave it there. That's the model I'm presenting. I think it helps us understand a bit of what's happening, but it shows you the work we have to do as well. So do we have time for questions? I think we do. Yes?
I don't really know how to word this, but I've heard many people refer to it this way, that like mushrooms, ayahuasca really is you're poisoning yourself, and your body is fighting off that poison, and you're basically having a fever dream. Didn't matter, I still did it anyway. But like, what, I don't know, just how you respond to that. Like, do you believe that is a little bit of the case, or is that totally not it at all?
It seems a little not in my wheelhouse. I don't know if I'd see it that way. I've definitely had fever states of delirium that can be shamanic and bring you somewhere. They're very difficult. I don't think you want to encourage that. I think but I don't see ayahuasca as a poison. I don't see magic mushrooms as a poison. These are plants meant to heal. I think people get really hung up on the purging element of ayahuasca, which I think there's a whole thing that may unpack there. So I don't think I necessarily see it that way. I don't see them as small doses of toxins that help us, but maybe people experience it that way, then that could be their truth. Yeah. Do you think it would make sense?
Yeah, no.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
you don't think they're poisonous mushrooms?
No.
No.
No, I think they're great gifts.
Okay.
We need to learn to use sacredly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know people do feel that in the stomach nausea,
Yeah.
but just add some ginger, right? A little citrus and a little bit of ginger. Seriously, there's no reason. Yeah. Yes.
For dosing, how do you titrate with mushrooms, which are like organic, ununiform?
I don't know. I've been trying to figure that out. It's pretty hard. Yeah, and I've had people had experiences where you think they have a good dose, but they're not having anything. So I think that you want to err on the side of high doses. But if you're going to do that, you need to be prepared for the possibility of, and this is why everyone should read the Book of the Dead. Read Bob Thurman's interpretation of it, his translation, Robert Thurman. He calls it the Book of Natural Liberation in the Between States. It's not really called the Book of the Dead. We're talking about between states, which is what the psychedelic is. Dreams are.
The Celtic one?
Celtic one? No, I don't know the Celtic one, no. Yeah, but
Book of the Dead is-
Tibetan.
Ah.
So what that helps us do is understand the transition between states, between life and death, between sleep and dream, and it helps us understand the thresholds and portals. And then when you see negative, like you see fierce deities, I think like the gentleman before me was presenting, he talked about the imagination. You need to see those fierce deities as manifestations of your own mind. They dissolve, you incorporate their power. I think there's a lot to be said in that kind of practice. So any fear or negative trip we have is our own subconscious coming out, unconscious. But if you're going to give people a high dose, you need to be skilled enough to contain that and to help people through it, because they could be turned off. They could have traumatic experiences, which are then negative and kind of the opposite of what we want. So first rule is first do no harm, right? Yes?
So I know that you're using
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you know about as kind of like the best, fastest, best way to ingest and to homogenize, like whether to grind it up and put it
Yeah.
in pills
Yeah.
or put it
Yeah.
in a tea?
I'll defer to Arrowwood. I think they got lots of great stuff.
Yeah.
I like teas. I think teas do a lot of benefit. Yes, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that also, like both the homogenization
Yeah.
as well as the best way to have most effect, right? Whether it's just tea
Yeah.
or eating or
Set and setting is a lot of it. Like you've got the medicine, but set and setting goes so far. Make sure you're in the proper setting. Make sure you're mentally prepared. Clean, light energy, prepare, evoke, intend. Yes.
Yeah, I would like to ask you why the primary option was the synthetic side. Is it difficult to isolate
No.
the organic?
No. That's a good question. I'm not sure. I know that usually scientists have access to, it's usually from pharmacies as opposed to your local grower, so that's part of it. And then it's thought to be more predictable, and you have consistency, and the quality is the same. Which from a scientific perspective, when you're going to measure, you want to be able to repeat it with the exact same effect with multiple people. I think that's the bias. Yeah. Who has an answer? Yes, sorry.
The map of consciousness is
Yeah.
framed. Is it suggested trajectory like a route to one?
It's always this.
Is it somehow ghost related as well?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I haven't figured all that out. I know it's a wheel. It turns. You move through it. I don't think it's linear. It's just a model. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I have. Yeah. It makes sense to me. I like the lightning vehicle up the middle. But you got to work on those other skills too. So I think that we underestimate the skills and the techniques it takes. So we're going to navigate this space. What can you do to meet the spirit with some skill and intention? Because it's a dance. That's why it's expanding in the contraction. You're pressing against her, she's pressing against you, and how do you move that energy? So I think your own personal skills, that's why like the previous speaker talked about visualization and imagination. I think you can go a lot farther. Yeah. Some people are very intellectual and like either academics or like long-term structured meditators have a hard time with psychedelic therapy. They don't necessarily have a great effect because they're so intellectually into reducing their mental functions, they don't have a lot of imagination to visualize. And that's part of enchantment is visualization. Yes?
Just in terms of strategy, I mean, I'm very interested in shamanism and like looking at these shamanic techniques as being like the roots of this kind of new movement in like psychotherapy. But like, would you consider the possibility of, say, like Jungian psychology as being the vehicle with which to move kind of psilocybin research and psychedelic research into psychiatry? And the reason I ask this is because it seems to me the phenomenology of the psychedelic experience, particularly ayahuasca and DMT, actually pretty clearly seems to vindicate Carl Jung's theories of what the phenomenology of the unconscious
Yep.
itself is.
Yep.
And this would actually help all of psychiatry to see that Carl Jung's theory is probably the best model of the unconscious that we have right now. And if they were to then move over to this Jungian model because of the phenomenological evidence of the psychedelic experience, then they were to, and then we have this kind of broad Jungian kind of psychiatric consensus, this itself would actually lend a kind of like solidity and coherence to like psychiatry.
Yep.
That would actually itself further justify and
Yep.
vindicate psychedelics as a,
Yep.
as a therapy.
Yeah, I think you just laid out one possible future for what may happen. I think it's going to become medicalized. It's going to become professionalized. They're going to go to whatever schools or disciplines can provide a structure to fit this. And I think Jungian psychotherapy seems to be one of the lead candidates. I'm not sure if I think that's the best. The one thing to remember is whatever happens to it, the truth of how these plant spirits manifest is through, it can't be controlled or contained. So it's what we do in our daily lives, it's what cultures do, it's what underground ceremony leaders are doing. So we need to continue to evoke the community perspective. It's not all psychotherapist patient. We need to understand that model has dramatic shortcomings for lots of different reasons. But I think what you're laying out is a coherent.
Yeah, like a vehicle for moving to this
Yep.
model.
Yep.
Like a
Yep.
good
Yep.
strategy to move forward.
Yeah, because we really don't have a culture where we have lineages of shamanism within industrial Western society. We lost that centuries ago with the land foreclosures and persecution of witchcraft and all that. So we're trying to recover it, and that's why the medicines are working their way around. And we need more syncretic versions of shamanism, which exist, and they'll remain to be played out. So I think that's part of the rediscovery. So I think that's where the true magic will be found. Yes.
stress with MDMA, and in a lot of psychedelic therapeutic circles, both above and underground, the two people whose work seems to be the most fundamental to psychedelic therapy is the IFS, the Internal Family Systems model, and Stan Groff's work.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think a large majority of people who are doing psychedelic therapy have all come through
that.
drug and practice
Okay,
training.
yes.
And I would say that those two models are probably
Yeah.
the foundation work for
Yeah.
any psychedelic therapy.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Yeah. The other possible model that may emerge is a Santo Daime or UV type model, where you have people advocating for the sacred nature of this and establishing, for lack of better words, churches, which then have their own rituals to contain and to manifest the spirit. So that's another possibility. I haven't heard of that yet. But thank you. I think you're bang on in that. Yeah.
Ron, just a
Yep.
quick announcement.
Yep. Okay.
In like 7 to 10 minutes, in the main room, we'll have Ann Wagner, updates from the field, MDMA, and cognitive behavioral research. That's the main topic here. And here in this room, we'll have Heather on therapeutic induction of altered states of consciousness. And then in the other room, there will be the mushroom growing workshop, the pollinator mushrooms.
Awesome.
And yeah,
Good
so
stuff.
you can
Okay.
keep doing questions until.
Any more questions, and then we'll try to close. Okay, one more question, and then we'll close. Does that sound good? Yeah.
The invoking of ceremony.
Yep. Yep.
Does that something you really did touch on? Did I miss that? Or?
I just think it needs to be explored. I'm more reviewing the science, but hinting that's where we go. And on that note, let's close our time together. Thank you. Appreciate everything.
That was brilliant. Could I have a copy of your presentation?
Sure, yeah.